and thanks very much to the York branch for inviting me to speak on the lessons of Chile. As Ian said, a very important discussion, and a discussion that in many ways sits quite well with the discussion that I think you had last week on the Paris Commune. The Paris Commune, I would imagine that one of the main lessons that was drawn out of that discussion was that it's impossible for the working class to use the established state machine to take power or to run society alongside the existing state machine. And it confirmed for Marxists that one of the key tasks facing socialists was to replace the existing capitalist state machine with a workers' state. In other words, you couldn't just gradually move bit by bit, piecemeal, to change society. You had to have a revolution. Now, the idea of a revolution, perhaps, is a word that brings a lot of images to the mind. When we talk about a revolution, we're not talking about a few individuals building barricades outside your houses and having sort of fistfights with the police. We're talking about the mass of society, the overwhelming majority of society, bringing their collective power and strength to form a completely different form of society, a socialist society based not on private ownership of the means of production, not on individual capitalist ownership of factories, but on the workers actually running the production, but also all elements of society, including, in the first instance at least, the state. Although, as Marxists have pointed out, under socialism, the state, the army, the police, the courts would increasingly move under a socialist system away from being a repressive type of institution into being an administrative type of institution. So on the 11th of September 1973, the other 9/11, the democratically elected Popular Unity government of Salvador Allende in Chile was overthrown by a military coup, completely unfortunately vindicating in a very negative way the points that I've just made, and that Marxists drew the conclusions from the Paris Commune and other struggles historically. Allende was overthrown, and the leader of the army, General Pinochet, or Pinochet, I think he's actually pronounced, established a regime that borrowed the methods of the Nazis and the fascists in Italy to try and brutally crush the Chilean working class. Now, Pinochet was fairly successful, again, unfortunately, in what he set out to do. A whole generation, really, of workers, leaders and activists were killed or driven into exile as a result of a failure to address the issues that I'm going to try and address in my introduction to this discussion. Because the events in Chile, which really developed between 1970, when the Popular Unity government was first elected, to the coup itself in 1973, was in many ways a laboratory test for the contending ideas in the workers' movement, between the ideas of Marxism that our party, the Socialist Party, and its co-thinkers in the Committee for a Workers' International attempt to put forward to guide the working class successfully, versus, on the other hand, the ideas of reformism, of gradualism. Here, if you like, not through the debate in a discussion in a meeting room, but on the ground in a country, those ideas clashed. And again, unfortunately, I will say, our ideas around reformism and the state were largely confirmed. I want to focus on those two fundamental lessons: the role of the state and this question of, can we change society gradually, or what are the issues around trying to change society gradually. But they're not the only lessons that we can learn from a study of Chile in 1970 to 73. One of the recurring problems that the workers' movement has to face is those that propose the idea of what we call popular fronts. And these are alliances of the workers' parties with smaller capitalist parties, on the argument that if the workers link up with as broad an alliance as possible with other people who seem to be friendly, that will somehow make it stronger. That's the theory that sits behind the popular front. It's an idea that was developed in its present form, really, in the 1930s. I'll deal with that a little bit in the course of my my introduction. But it's a danger that the workers' movement needs to try and avoid. And linked to the role of popular fronts is the theory of the so-called two-stage theory of political development, or historical development, really, that is put forward by many in the Communist Party. Even to this day, this idea is put forward that where in a backward, underdeveloped country, that the first stage of the two-stage theory is to establish democracy, capitalist democracy, and only then, once you've got a sort of a system like you've got in America or Britain or France, once you've got capitalist democracy, only at that point can you then go on to think about the second stage, which is socialism. The tragedy is, of course, is that you never get beyond the first stage, because in struggling for capitalist democracy, as I'll explain, the workers' movement always is defeated in this situation. And in contrast to that are the ideas first put forward by Leon Trotsky in his theory of permanent revolution. So if we take those, and I'm not going to bombard you with any more sort of, big ideas, but if we just try and use those ideas as a focus on what actually happened in Chile in 1970 to 73, we've got the role of the state. Can we change society gradually? Should the workers' movement ally itself with other capitalist parties that are in favour of democracy? Should it form popular fronts, or should it struggle to take power itself? Those are the things that I want to focus on. Now, if we look at Chile before 1970, then effectively we see quite a developed country by Latin American standards. The majority of people in Chile lived not on the land, but actually in the cities. Chile had industrialized to a far greater extent than most of the other Latin American countries. However, it had industrialized not through the Chileans themselves getting their act together and thinking, right, we need to build factories in the way that had happened in England, in France, most of Europe, and in the United States. It had happened because American imperialism and British imperialism as well had seen that Chile is a major producer of, in particular, copper and also nitrates that are vital for production of manufacturing goods. And what happened was the imperialist powers invested large amounts of money in developing copper and nitrate production in Chile, but they did it through working alongside the big landowners, because although Chile was quite industrialized, large tracts of land in Chile were still owned by the old kind of feudal landlords that are known in Latin America as the latifundia, giant landowners, big landed estates, which were farmed by peasants. The peasants were about 30% of the Chilean population. So the working class and the city-based sections of the population outweighed the peasantry. But the land question was a really important question as far as Chile was concerned, because in general, about 75% of all the land in the country was concentrated in the hands of about 5% of the population. So it kind of follows that for the rest of the peasants working on the land, they owned very small tracts of land and could barely eke out a living. And historically, one of the things that needs to happen in order for society to develop and move forward is that the land controlled by the big landowners has to be broken up. That's because the big landowners rest on the fact that they can gain what they need for their luxurious lifestyles by exploiting the labor of the peasants. And the labor of the peasants is not good enough. It's not because they don't work hard. It's just that that it's not good enough to compete and to produce in the way that mechanized farming was able to do in other parts of the world. And that was a key development that took place across Europe in the 16th, 17th, 18th and 19th centuries, and to some extent the 20th century as well, was the breaking up of the old feudal estates. And that did two things. It allowed the introduction of mechanized farming that was far more efficient, and it drove the peasants into the cities and towns to create a working class that was then able to develop industry and so on. By 1940, the majority, as I say, of Chileans lived in cities, and the TUC of Chile was formed in 1953. The Chilean Socialist Party had quite a long and experienced existence. It developed quite a left-wing program, in fact, which I'll go into a little bit later. There was also a Chilean Communist Party. It's quite interesting, actually. I haven't really got time to go into all the ins and outs of what happened, but it's almost a lead-off in itself. But the workers in Chile instinctively looked towards socialist policies and left-wing policies. But throughout the 50s and 60s, there were growing problems. The problem on the land meant that although there was the potential for a very rich cultivation program, Chile ended up actually having to import food because the latifundios didn't invest. They relied on this super exploitation of the peasants. And imperialism increasingly took the raw materials of copper and nitrates and other ores that were mined in Chile and took them out of Chile and used them in manufacturing in their own countries. And this then stopped the development of a kind of a worked out infrastructure as far as Chilean industry was concerned. It led to inflation and poverty as far as the workers. So how could Chilean society deal with these problems? Well, first of all, it had to redistribute the land and mechanize it. Secondly, it had to remove the power of the foreign companies and develop a Chilean-based industry. And thirdly, develop a proper infrastructure of communication. If you like, a network of the equivalent of what we've got, of railways that interlink, of motorways, of transport links, and so on. Now, those tasks are tasks that are associated with what Marxists call the bourgeois democratic revolution. They're tasks, as I said, that were completed in England and the UK in the 16th and 17th century. And they were also then followed by countries like Holland, by France, to some extent Germany and America in the 19th century. So at that point, though, capitalism itself was new, and the capitalist class, who were a revolutionary class at that point, were prepared to struggle and fight against the old order. The problem with Chile, and in fact most of the rest of what we sometimes refer to as the third world or the colonial world, the poorer sections of the world, is that capitalism had developed so that in Europe and America to such an extent that they then use that power to either impose a colonial empire, or they use their financial power to stop the development of a native capitalist class. So there were some Chilean capitalists. It's not the case that there were none, but in comparison with Britain, there were few and far between. And most of them were more scared of the workers than they were of actually taking on imperialism and the old land owning latifundia. And this was really the same situation which confronted the Russian workers in 1917 that Trotsky wrote about in his theory of permanent revolution. And what Trotsky pointed out, and again, this is a discussion in its own right, but hopefully, a lead off like this will set off other discussions, and comrades can come in on some of this point. That Trotsky explained that whilst there should have been a bourgeois democratic revolution in Russia in 1917, the bourgeois didn't exist in any powerful form, and therefore the only revolutionary class capable of actually taking power and carrying through those tasks was the working class. And that having taken power, yes, they would carry out the tasks of the capitalist revolution, the bourgeois revolution, of redistributing the land, of developing an infrastructure, of establishing a state, of resolving perhaps issues of language, because many countries were sort of thrown together. You had some tribes, for example, in the north of Chile, I think it's the Arauco Indians that had their own dialects and ways of speaking, as opposed to the majority of Chileans that spoke a more standard Spanish. So you would have those are the tasks. But what Trotsky would have argued if he would have been sat down in 1970 is that what the workers in Chile had to do was, yes, they had to take power, yes, they had to carry out those tasks, but they wouldn't stop at that. Having then started the process of redistributing the land, of nationalising industry and so on, you wouldn't then hand it back to the capitalists and allow the capitalists then to develop. No. What you would do is you would use the fact that you have control of society to then start to develop society down a socialist and a collective way, and you would use that as part of an international program of appealing for a socialist federation of Latin American states. And that's essentially the position that the militant, the forerunner of the Socialist Party, argued throughout the early 70s, so far as Chile was concerned, in contrast to what the Popular Unity government would do. But just before we get there, and I appreciate the fact I've been going for a bit and we haven't even reached the actual start of the government, but it's quite interesting this, and I it just pays to read some of this stuff. That the Chilean Socialist Party, because of the experience that the workers have been through, actually understood a lot of what I've just spoken about, in words at least, but the leaders, unfortunately, were not prepared to go along with it. On your party card, if you were a member of the Chilean Socialist Party, this was written. It said the capitalist class is represented by the existing state, which is an oppressive organism of one class over another. The system of capitalist production based on the private ownership of the land, the instruments of production, exchange, credit and transport should of necessity be replaced by a socialist economic system in which the above-mentioned private property is transferred into collective property. And then it goes on. In order to realise this aim, the Socialist Party will propose the economic and political unity of the peoples of Latin America to achieve the federation of socialist republics of the continent and the creation of an anti-imperialist policy. On paper, that is not a million miles away from the kind of programme that we were putting forward at the time. But in practice, unfortunately, the Chilean Socialist Party found itself, or at least the leaders of the Chilean Socialist Party, found itself out-argued by the Chilean Communist Party that continued to propose this idea that I spoke about in my introduction of the two-stage theory, that rather than struggle for socialism and rather than the workers taking power, the first stage was to win capitalist democracy and move very, very slowly. And in order to speed things up a little bit in terms of what happened, in the run-up to 1970, there had been a whole period of instability, of strikes, and so on. The capitalist parties, or the establishment parties, to be more precise, there were two main ones. There was the National Party, which was a party that basically defended imperialism and the feudal landlords. And then there was a party, the Christian Democrats, that tried to model themselves on the German Christian Democrats that you probably would have, even if you're not fully familiar with them, you'll have heard of them, the Angela Merkel style party in Germany, led by a character called Frey. And in theory, they were in favour of modernisation. And to some extent, they'd been forced to actually try and carry out some land redistribution. They'd even carried out some partial nationalisations to try and bring some independent resources into the Chilean state to enable it then to be able to try and develop the state for the in the interests of the Chilean capitalists. They didn't go anything like far enough. They were very, very slow. And of course, in reality, they resolved none of the problems, to the extent that eventually they split. And the right wing went off more towards the National Party, and a more liberal grouping that became known as MAPU was formed. And MAPU, and this is where we hit the Popular Front, MAPU was encouraged to join an alliance with the Communist Party and the Socialist Party and some of the smaller parties into what became known as Popular Unity, or a Popular Front, led by Salvador Allende, but with MAPU, a party with its roots and its ideology firmly in the camp of capitalism, firmly opposed to the idea of the workers taking power. Allende compromised and was prepared to allow MAPU into the alliance, and eventually in 1917 won, but without a clear majority. He compromised, recognised the right for the army to remain independent, what was something that was to become an absolutely key demand and a key issue as things moved forward. For the first year and a half, there was limited change. Most of the change was in the interest of the capitalist class itself. And by 1972, the workers were becoming more and more impatient with Allende and the Popular Unity government. That didn't mean that they were at this stage looking for alternatives, but they were beginning to form their own organisations separate from the official government. So in the landed areas, in the peasant areas in particular, the peasants formed committees to begin to discuss and try and organise the redistribution of land. And similarly in the cities, factory committees began to develop that began to challenge the capitalist owners, and in some cases the imperialist owners. But of course, it wasn't just the workers that were beginning to get organised. The far right also were beginning to get organised as well. And we reported in our paper, The Militant, in 1971, that according to an official police report, more than 2,000 men have been recruited into assault groups with a view to causing the breaking down of the transport system, interruptions in the gas, electricity and water supply, and in this manner cause general discontent. So by not changing things directly, Allende has left a gap for the right to begin to organise. And at this stage, they're not the dominant force. They never actually did become the dominant force, but the right were beginning to organise and were starting to cause chaos in a small way through acts of sabotage and attacks on leaders of the movement. The pressure from the masses pushed Allende in 1971, when he gained a larger majority, to nationalise the copper mines in their entirety. And that was a huge step forward. That was a really positive step. However, he didn't nationalise everything. He left significant levers in the hands of private industry. And as I say, the state, the army, was left to remain supposedly neutral above society. By nationalising the copper mines, this massively encouraged the workers, and the workers' committees began to take on a real force in society. The workers gained enthusiasm from and courage and determination from the fact that he nationalised the copper mines, and began to demand better reforms in health and education. Demonstrations start to take place, putting pressure on Allende, but also supporting Allende, because the workers on the ground understood that reaction was also organising, and they needed Allende to take steps to neutralise the army and so on. We would argue that during 1971 through to 1973, those workers' organisations were very similar to the Soviets that developed in Russia in 1905 and more importantly in 1917. There were elements of dual power. What do we mean by dual power? On the one hand, you've got the official government, the Popular Unity government with Salvador Allende and the Popular Unity, but control things on the ground. And that is the workers' state that is just starting to emerge, but has not overpowered or not overthrown the official government. And the workers' committees had a degree of dual power, because they often controlled in certain areas of, particularly in Santiago, the capital, they controlled large areas of the capital in terms of the distribution of food, in terms of elements of policing, and in terms of production in the factories themselves. So you have a comparison with what emerged in Russia in 1917, but unlike in Russia, where the Bolsheviks had a clear understanding of the need to completely transform society to establish Soviet power, workers' committee power, in Chile, Allende actually argued against that and was constantly telling the workers' organizations, the unofficial organs of workers' power, that they couldn't disobey the law, whilst on the other hand, the far right, the assassination gangs, were given more or less free license to attack. Now, one of the things about dual power is it cannot last forever. You can't have a situation where on the one hand the workers are running society and on the other hand the capitalists are running society. That can exist for a period of time, and it existed for 18 months to 2 years in Chile. But at a certain point, either the workers had to take power, or it was inevitable that the military would intervene, or the forces of reaction would intervene and overthrow the Allende government and establish a police dictatorship. Now, we study Chile and we study what happened in Chile, not just purely from an historical interest. The workers' movement in Britain will at some stage in the future face similar sorts of governments, maybe not a popular front because of the historic development of Britain, but we will face reformist governments in Britain. We came fairly close to one actually with Jeremy Corbyn, but he didn't miss forming a government by very much. And we supported Jeremy Corbyn, or rather we supported the progressive elements of Jeremy Corbyn, but we explained, if you want to go back and look at the pages of the Socialist, that the problems that a Jeremy Corbyn government would face, that inevitably the capitalist class would undermine and would do everything they could to try and undermine that government, both economically and eventually if they couldn't succeed by doing it through democratic means and economic means, then the army and the police would be used against a left Labour government. Now, that was not likely to happen in the short term with Jeremy Corbyn. He didn't. His programme never really threatened capitalism, and of course, he was never elected. But we are confident in the future have left governments that will be reformist, will support the reforms that are carried out, but will be the first to point out that what reformism does is it neither resolves all the problems that the workers face, but what it also does is it irritates, a bit like sticking a stick into a beehive. It irritates the capitalist class, and the capitalists will eventually attack and do everything they can to undermine the reformist government. And that's what happened in Chile. The attempt to change things generally wound up the Chilean capitalists and the reaction. They undermined the government economically, and eventually, when the workers' movement began to run out of steam in the summer of 1973, at that precise point, the army realised that if it didn't intervene, there was a chance that the workers might actually take power. And in September 1973, despite Allende saying, "Don't worry about it, the army are our friends," in fact, he brought 2 or 3 of the generals into the government as proof that, look, they're our buddies, we're all friends together. Despite that, Pinochet launched the coup on September the 11th, 1973. And there's no question about the bravery of Salvador Allende. He stood in the presidential palace in Santiago, refused to flee the country, but died tragically in the ruins of that palace. More importantly than Allende as an individual, as I said at the start, was the fact that the coup cost the lives of tens of thousands of Chilean socialists, trade unionists, communists and activists. Many of them were driven into exile. And it's taken a generation really for the Chilean working class to recover anything like the combativity that it had. Pinochet used the methods of fascism, but was not a fascist himself. He was a more traditional military dictator. Chile then was used as a testbed for the capitalists in the 1970s as a precursor almost as to what the British and most working classes had to face in the 1980s of a move towards neoliberalism, attacks on the working class, the exploitation of the working class, and so on. So British workers have got many reasons to try and learn the lessons of what happened to Chile. So for Marxists, Chile is a testbed of the failure of reformism, but also the possibilities that could have existed had there been a revolutionary party. And that's what we have to, I think, rededicate our lives to building that party, to ensure that when things develop in this country, we don't end up with a Chile, but we end up with a Russia, and the workers actually take power and develop socialism.